Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today I'm quilting my diamond Dresden plate, and I called it that because of the quilting design we're going to be quilting together with rulers. So let's get on the machine and learn how we're going to stitch this step by step. So I'm getting started quilting this block, and I have decided to use ruler foot quilting for the whole beginning section, and I might end up actually leaving that foot on for most of this block. If you don't have a ruler foot, please understand you can do all of these designs with either regular free motion quilting or with your walking foot. I've also already stitched in the ditch around the center circle and around these petal shapes. And I've broken it up so that way I'm stitching in the ditch and kind of leaving those two petals together that are filled with that butterfly feather design. I've also stitched in the ditch between the block background and border, and that's pretty much all of the securing that I needed to do so I could take my pens out and be able to quilt this easily. Now I'm using template number 7 from the Dresden plate template set, placing it right in that center circle. And I have marked the circle that I want to stitch on as well, just to make sure that I have a nice visual so I know what I'm aiming for. So if I get off the marked line, then I know something's up and I need to double check myself. But what I'm doing is pressing down on that template, and I'm pressing it against that ruler foot. That ruler foot is special. It has a high edge that allows me to press that template in place, and it helps guide the foot. But I still have to do a lot of manipulation of the quilt. So you can see as I'm pushing it through the machine, my hands are rotating the block. These two fingers pressing really firmly down on that template to make sure it doesn't slip, and also pressing against the foot at the same time. Also notice how slowly I'm running the machine. I'm not just putting my foot down and cranking it through. I'm working slowly, about 10 stitches, then I rotate the quilt and shift it in the right position so that way I stay exactly where I want to stay. So here I'm just shifting it around again, and I want to make sure that I connect with my starting line nice and smooth. So really, ruler foot quilting is just a matter of using the ruler as a guide for your foot. It does require having the ruler foot, because if you tried to do this with a regular free motion quilting foot, you could hop on top of the ruler and break a needle. It really is very scary when that happens and not any fun. So make sure to use a ruler foot for that technique. Now I'm stitching in for the spiral. This is an open spiral. So I'm just making a nice smooth movement to the inside, swirling around and then coming back out. Now in this situation, the ruler foot isn't as helpful because it has a completely solid base, but it's open enough on the inside that I can kind of see down into it, and I can see roughly what I'm doing. I can see where that line of stitching is. And come all the way back out again, meet up with that outer circle, and that looks good. Now if you wanted to add a little bit more drama to this, you could stitch around that outer circle again, just doing some travel stitching. That's going to add a little extra drama to the block, an extra layer of thread. This is like using a bold font if you're writing. It adds extra thread on top of itself, and that makes it stand out more on the surface of your quilt. It adds more drama because, of course, it's going to stand out better and just punch up that circle shape. It's going to make it stand out really nicely. It's completely optional, of course, not at all required. And as you can see, I'm wobbling just a bit as I stitch around it. So I'm going to grab my template again and see if that can help me. Pressing firmly down on the template, first pressing against the ruler foot, and see if that helps me with that travel stitching, staying right on the line. So there we go. That's the center stitched. I'm going to break thread and move to this outer section, start filling in the feathers, and then we have more ruler foot quilting in these diamond Dresdens. So now it's time to quilt our feather shape, and I call this a butterfly feather because it kind of looks like a butterfly. So start out with that little kind of arch shape and stitch up and then stitch all the way back to my starting line, that outline of the center circle. And then now I'm going to branch out with the feathers. So swirl out, come around, And this time, let's do a bump feather. Let's just kind of mix it up a bit. I've shown you the same travel back feather several times. This is a different type. We're going to stitch up the stem and out around the next feather. We're going to bump against the feather before. So I'm going to hit that top of the feather and then travel stitch back. And this works great if your feather is marked because you can see exactly where you need to stop and bump out for the next feather. That looks good. And please know that it is absolutely open to you to fill in more if you want to add more feathers, if you want to add swirls or lines or echoes or anything within that shape. That's absolutely open to you. It's always allowed to add more texture and funky designs to your quilt. So now we're going to do the opposite side, and I want to do this the exact same way, except if you notice we're now moving in the opposite direction. We're swirling out and down. It's going to feel different. I know it sounds weird, but just the difference between coming down the line and then in this case back up, it's going to feel different. And for me, that was a very big deal when I first started quilting feathers. I just couldn't wrap my brain around stitching in this opposite direction. So if it feels like a struggle for you, figure out which direction feels more natural to you and stick with it. So bumped against that previous feather, stitching down, and now I'll bump out for the last one. There we go. Beautiful feather, filling in those two diamond shapes completely. Those two petal shapes. Now I'm going to travel stitch down. And this is where we create and turn this pointy petal Dresden into a diamond Dresden. I'm going to stitch over and I'm going to grab a straight edge ruler. So basically I'm just going to use, this is template number 3 from the Dresden plate template set. And I'm going to line this up so it's right on that stitch in the ditch seam line, right there between those two Dresden plate petals. And I'm going to stitch straight down. So here what I'm doing is I'm pressing down on the ruler with my fingertips and also against the ruler foot. I'm making sure that the ruler doesn't slip off that line. I want that edge to stay in nice alignment with that seam line. And I'm going to stitch down until the edge of this presser foot is right on the edge of the applique, just like that. If I took my needle all the way down, then I would be stitching off the edge. I want to stay 1/4 of an inch away from the edges of this Dresden plate petal. So as I stitch to the corner and stop, you can see the foot is this foot is a full 1/2 inch. And so I should have the edge right here lined up and also the opposite edge. And that looks really good. And that's going to keep my lines evenly spaced 1/4 of an inch from the edges of that shape. It's an internal echo and it looks so cool. I love this kind of design because it basically just plays off the piecing and really lets the piecing shine. It's just going to emphasize that piece shape, that petal shape, and just make it look that much better. There we go. So now the next step is to do that all over again. We're going to travel stitch over 1/4 of an inch right on that outline of the circle. And this time I'm going to be lining up the edge of my ruler with the line I just stitched, plus I'm going to be lining up the second line of the ruler right on that stitched in the ditch seam line. So I can line up 2 lines basically and make sure it's really accurate. So now I'm going to stitch straight on down. Again, pressing firmly on that ruler. And because I'm kind of stitching the opposite way, I switched hands. And that's another thing. You can absolutely switch hands. You also don't have to rotate the block. You can just move the ruler. In this case, I'm just going to move the ruler, not the whole block. I just have to remember what I'm doing and make sure I don't mess it up. And so now I'm going to move the ruler again and stitch in this direction. Whoop. I don't want to overshoot it. I think I can back up 1 stitch here. There we go. What I was doing is I was looking at my needle, and because I was focusing on my needle, I almost overshot where I wanted to line up this line. So here we go. I'm lining up again, and I can complete that diamond effect. And your lines are going to cross. As you come back in, they're going to cross just like that, and I think that looks really great. Kind of looks
This reminds me of a kind of a cartoony, a gaming symbol for coins. I don't know why, but it does. It makes me laugh. So I really like that, and I think it worked out really, really well. And, you know, moving on, I'm just going to continue with these repetition of designs. All I'm going to do is just fill in this space with another butterfly feather, fill in the next with another set of repeating lines, just the exact same way. If you don't have a ruler, please understand this is 100% optional. You can stitch these straight lines in regular free motion quilting without any ruler assistance. When you do that, try and keep the index finger of your hand parallel with your foot, and that will help you keep the lines nice and straight. Or another alternative is to grab a walking foot and just simply stitch those straight lines with a walking foot. So now that that area is knocked out, I'm gonna finish it up, quilting through it. I'll meet you back here when you're ready to knock out the background. The next step is to quilt an outline around the Dresden plate, and I'm using my ruler. Again, this is template number 3 to guide. What I'm doing is lining up the edge of the template in line with the edge of that applique, pressing firmly and pressing against my ruler foot as I stitch right down. And what's nice is the inside curves are easy to see because you can use the foot. You just basically stitch down until the edge of the foot is lining up on both petal shapes. The outer points are harder to guesstimate. So what I did was took another ruler, this is just a square ruler, placed it on and was able to mark 1/4 inch from the tip. And that's really helpful because it allows you to know exactly where to stop and change direction. Otherwise you get out here and it's easy to undershoot and overshoot your line. Now I can just stitch right to the blue dot, rotate, and quickly move this around. Now you might be wondering why I'm rotating the block. I do find it easier when I'm stitching straight lines to feed the quilt through the machine straight through. So that's why I continue to rotate. You don't have to, however. I could position the ruler to the back like this and stitch straight over. It just feels very awkward to me. It's not my favorite. And personally, I just think whatever feels more natural to you is going to end up probably producing better looking stitches. So that's why I always just rotate it around and keep spinning the block around as I stitch each line. Now, if you were quilting with this with a walking foot, you go around just the exact same way, just rotating it around, knocking out all of those straight lines. Now we've got another set of straight lines here that's going to be a kind of an inner outline. It's about 1/4 inch away from that stitch in the ditch line. So I want to go ahead and knock out that too. My background design is sharp stippling. So what I'm going to do is fill in this space with sharp stippling and use that to connect to that opposite line. So sharp stippling is just a wiggly line that occasionally comes to sharp points. And I'm being careful not to stitch further than 1/4 inch close to that seam line. I can get right up to it, but I don't want to stitch closer than that. And I think I'll stop right there and switch to my straight line quilting. So grab my ruler again. This time I'm lining it up right with that seam line between the inner block and the border. And I'm going to stitch straight on down. And doing this, I just simply avoided a thread break. I mean, really, that's all it's down to. I could have broken thread, moved to the outline, stitched that first, and then done this sharp stippling. There's always any order that you could quilt your quilt in. There's 100 different ways. I like to avoid thread breaks because I have to tie off and bury those thread tails, which takes, you know, maybe 3 minutes, but still, it's one of those things I like to avoid if I can by connecting designs together and fluidly stitching through them just like this so that one design connects to the next design so that way I don't have to stop quilting and break thread and move things around. So here I'm just lining up, pressing firmly on the template, making sure it's lined up all the way down the full length of that seam. Press firmly and also press against the edge of the foot as I guide the entire block through the machine. And this is again a situation where I would rotate. I don't see any reason not to. The block is small enough that you don't have to. you don't, and it's not cumbersome. It's not a problem to rotate this through the arm of the machine, and particularly if you're stitching this in a clockwise direction, meaning the design going onto the fabric in a clockwise direction, it's going to feel very easy. So there's no reason not to rotate it around so you can see what you're doing and make the best possible nice straight line. I always get questions like, well, how does that apply to a real quilt, a really big quilt? And honestly, I think that this still applies the exact same way. Sometimes I'll rotate even on a big quilt if I think that that will make the design look better or if it will make it feel easier. And then also on a big quilt, I will break thread more often. So if I was in the center of a massively huge quilt, I might stitch one of these lines and break thread, rotate the quilt, and stitch another line, rotate the quilt, and break thread a lot more. So I think you just have to kind of change the rules as you need to and adjust with every project that you create. And for this particular one, rotation, being able to swing the block around, not a problem. It's not a problem, not a hassle. So now I'm coming back around to where my line of stitching started. There we go. I can take that ruler and put it away because I find that if I keep the ruler in my hand, I'll want to use it. So I have to get it away from me. Now I'm going to switch back to my sharp stippling, and this is just a wiggly line that forms sharp points, and I want to kind of interlock this together with the design I've already stitched so that way it looks continuous. It doesn't look like I stopped and stitched something else or that the design was broken in any way. And this is a very fluid, free-form design. Don't feel like you can't stop though and travel stitch if you need to. Sometimes you might. I just snuck through and was able to stitch through that area. And then here I think I'll probably travel stitch down along that outline before I branch out and kind of stitch that wiggly flame shape into this new space. So it's a very flowing, free-form design. If you want some practice to stitching back and form flame shapes like this on your quilt, is a good place to start. And of course there is a practice worksheet included in your quilt pattern, so definitely give that a go. Mark it onto a practice quilt sandwich, something small, and play with quilting it several times. You can also just mark this design in the background of your block. That's also included in the quilt pattern as well. Now I've got a little weird gap here, so I want to make sure to fill that in, and then I'll come down and fill in this space. Travel stitch up and swirl a new flame into that area. That's looking good. So I'm just going to continue working my way around this background, filling more sharp stippling into this area. Our very last thing to quilt is our echo shell border, or little rainbows. We filled in the borders of all of our blocks with this design. It just keeps it consistent, and it adds a really nice echoing texture to the edges of the quilt and the edges of each block. So you start with that biggest shape and then travel stitch inside and stitch the next arch shape and try and quilt those all in one pass. That kind of helps, at least for me, not to wobble as I stitch that shape. And definitely, play around with how you grip the quilt, what angle that you have it, and that can definitely help too. Sometimes I find it's easier when the shape is horizontal like this, and sometimes it's easier when it's vertical. It just really depends on what you're feeling like. And then now I'm going to swing into the circle in the corner. Circles in the corner. And again, I'm going to stitch around this twice. I'm going to travel stitch around it twice just to make that corner circle stand out really nicely. And then stitch inside for the spiral. And this is a closed spiral. I'm going to stitch all the way in, filling in the space completely. And then I'm going to travel stitch slowly all the way out. Slow and careful stitching. And it is harder to see with the ruler foot on. If you want to switch to regular free motion quilting foot for the border, that would probably be a better idea. I have my chair positioned up a little higher, so I'm looking straight down into that circle, and so I can see the needle pretty clearly. It is more open probably than what it looks like in the video. So that's how I'm going to continue quilting this little rainbows or echo shell design, just stitching each arch shape and travel stitching inside and filling in all of those echoes nice and smooth, trying to knock that out in one smooth pass, and then just travel stitching right in the ditch to reach the next line of quilting. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish quilting your diamond Dresden plate.
So that's it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed learning how to piece and quilt this diamond Dresden plate with me. If you'd like to find the quilt pattern, you can find it at leahday.com/blockparty. If you have any questions about this piecing or quilting process, please ask in the comments below. I really want to help you learn more about making beautiful quilts. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.